King John. Tonight, we drift beyond the veil of comfort, past the polished portraits of noble kings and golden crowns, into a darker chamber of history. A place where thrones do not gleam, but splinter, where power breathes not greatness, but grief. There was a king, born of legend, brother to a lion, heir to an empire stretching from the forests of Normandy to the high cliffs of Dover. And yet, in the end, remembered only for betrayal, for cruelty, and for the muffled whispers of those who prayed he would fall. Let us close our eyes and turn back the pages of time, to the year of our Lord, 1199, to the reign of King John. He was the youngest son of Henry II, never meant to wear the crown. Called John Lackland as a child, because there was nothing left for him. His destiny was always in the shadows, overlooked beside warrior brothers and charismatic princes. He grew not in greatness, but in envy. When his elder brother Richard the Lionheart rode to glory on crusade, John stayed behind, scheming. And when Richard was captured and held for ransom, John betrayed him, offering bribes to keep his own brother imprisoned. Such was the heart of a man not made for war, nor for loyalty, but for quiet treachery. Still, fate crowned him. When Richard died in 1199, the crown passed not to a mighty warrior or a beloved noble, but to a man no one trusted. John's rule began with suspicion and storms. His empire, inherited but fragile, spanned from England to much of France. But John, rash and paranoid, soon lost Normandy to the King of France, and with it, the loyalty of many nobles. He taxed them to fill his war chest. He sold justice to the highest bidder. He treated the law not as sacred, but as a tool. And as his enemies grew, so too did his cruelty. It is in the year 1212 that whispers turned into screams. Arthur of Brittany, John's young nephew, had a claim to the throne. The boy was captured, locked away in the dark bowels of Rouen Castle. And there, he vanished. Many believed John killed him with his own hands, drunken and raging. Others said Arthur was tortured until he could scream no more. Whatever the truth, Arthur was never seen again. Nobles recoiled in horror. Mothers clutched their children tighter. But John was not finished. In 1207, he clashed with the Pope, refusing to accept the Church's appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. In response, England was placed under interdict, church bells silenced, sacraments withheld, the dead denied burial. And when the Pope excommunicated John himself, the king responded not with penitence but with plunder. Monasteries stripped, clergy humiliated. Even his people, the very peasants who labored beneath his rule, were not spared. John demanded impossible taxes. When they could not pay, he seized their land, their animals, their children. In one village, he ordered the hanging of a man for killing a royal deer. In another, he burned crops to punish a mislevy. But perhaps worst of all was what he did to his own knights. By 1215, the barons had had enough. They rose in revolt, not for conquest, but for restraint. They forced John to Runnymede, where the Thames winds through mist and reeds, and there they pressed into his shaking hands a document, one that would echo through time. The Magna Carta. It declared that even a king must obey the law. John sealed it, resentfully, and broke it within weeks. Civil war ignited. French troops were invited into England. Chaos reigned. And then, as if nature itself had turned against him, John fled across the marshes of the Washington. His baggage train, loaded with treasures, jewels, even the crown jewels themselves, sank into the mud and was lost forever. Wet, ill, humiliated, he retreated to Newark Castle. And there, In October of 1216, he died. Some said of dysentery, others whispered poison. But few wept. A monk wrote plainly, "Foul as it is, hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John." History would not be kind, nor should it have been. He was the king who lost a continent, who defied the church, who betrayed his blood, who ground his people into misery, and yet who, by his tyranny, gave rise to the first great check upon absolute power. King John left behind no love, no glory, no grand victories. Only a legacy carved from mistrust and fear, and a scroll that would one day birth liberty. Such is the irony of power, it often plants the seeds of its undoing. Caligula. The name drips from the pages of history like a stain, dark, unforgettable, and strangely alluring. He was a boy in little soldiers' boots once, giggling in the camps of the Rhine. But by the time his name echoed through the marbled halls of Rome, it had grown monstrous, bloated with cruelty, delirium, and divine ambition. Tonight, dear dreamer, we descended to the madness of imperial power, where a child of war became a god in his own mind, and the empire trembled beneath his sandals. This is not just the tale of a tyrant, it is the slow unraveling of a soul consumed by shadows. So settle in. Let the quiet of night gather round. Let history whisper, as the story of Caligula begins. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus in the year 12 AD, a golden child of Rome's first dynasty. His father, Germanicus, was adored by the people, a soldier's general, brave and kind. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was fierce and noble, descended from Augustus himself. But the palace was no cradle of peace. It was a theater of masks, betrayal, and slow-moving poison. As a boy, Caligula walked among soldiers on the northern front, dressed in miniature armor and tiny military boots, Caligi, they were called. The men laughed and adored him, calling him Little Boots Caligula, a nickname meant in jest, and yet one that would eclipse his real name forever. When Germanicus died, likely poisoned on imperial orders, Caligula's world darkened. His mother clashed with Emperor Tiberius and was exiled, starved to death. His brothers suffered similar fates, and so the boy who once played at war was left an orphan of ambition, raised under the leering eye of a paranoid old emperor. Tiberius, retreating to the decadent island of Capri, took the teenage Caligula into his care. There, in villas carved into cliffs above the sea, the young prince witnessed horrors dressed as pleasures, executions at banquets, forced indulgence, a court soaked in suspicion and silence. And through it all, Caligula smiled, watched, learned. He survived where others did not. In 37 AD, Tiberius died, perhaps smothered by Caligula's own hand. The Senate hailed the young man as emperor. The people rejoiced. Rome exhaled. At last, a child of Germanicus, beloved Germanicus, was on the throne. Statues were raised. Sacrifices made. The city glowed with hope. For 6 months, Caligula ruled with strange mercy. He pardoned prisoners, gave generous games, shared his wealth. It was as if the golden child had returned. But then the fever came. A sudden illness struck him, violent, burning, and near fatal. He survived, but something had shifted. When Caligula recovered, the man who emerged was not the same. The boy emperor was gone. In his place stood something else, draped in purple, crowned in madness. He declared himself a living god. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Jupiter in flesh. He built temples to himself, placed his own face on sacred statues, demanded that citizens worship his image with incense and prayer. Senators were mocked, humiliated, killed for sport. He appointed his horse, and Citatus, as a priest, and joked, or perhaps did not joke, about making the animal a consul. He wandered the palace at night dressed as Venus. He ordered the moon to appear before him. He threatened to make his beloved Rome into a desert, brick by golden brick, just to feel the thrill of power. And worst of all, behind the spectacle, lay cruelty. Families ruined on whim, daughters assaulted, friends betrayed. Those closest to him watched each breath, unsure if it would be their last. The emperor had become a storm, laughing one moment, executing the next. But even storms burn out. Even madness meets a mirror. The cynic grew silent with fear, the Praetorian Guard uneasy. Rumors swirled that Caligula would abandon Rome for Egypt, declare himself a pharaoh, rule not as emperor, but as living god-king. And so, in 41 AD, in a quiet corridor beneath the Palatine palaces, the knives came out. Cassius Chaerea, a guard Caligula had mocked for his voice, struck the first blow. Others followed. Blood soaked the marble. The divine emperor, the living god, the last child of Germanicus, fell silent at last. His body was left in the shadows, half covered in a cloak. Rome awoke to whispers and disbelief. The tyrant was dead. But the wound he left in the soul of the empire remained. What is power, dear dreamer, when untethered from mercy? What is legacy, when carved in cruelty and madness? Caligula reigned only 4 years, but the echo of his rule reverberated for centuries. He reminds us that even those born in gold may rot from within, and that the mind, unmoored by grief and poisoned by power, can become a nation's nightmare. He began as a child in tiny boots. He ended as a god no one believed in. King Leopold. The name alone carries the weight of ghosts. In the grand halls of European monarchy, few kings cloaked themselves in such stately dignity while casting so long and blood-soaked a shadow. He wore a beard like a prophet and robes like a saint. But beneath the gold-stitched splendor beat the heart of a man driven by greed, delusion, and a hunger for dominion that would shame the ancient emperors. He was not born to be a tyrant. Or perhaps he was. From the moment Leopold II of Belgium was born in 1835, the second king of the smaller young nation, he was set upon proving that Belgium, a patchwork state dwarfed by European empires, could be mighty. But it would not be Europe he sought to rule. No, his dreams pointed south, across oceans, into the uncharted forest of Africa. He would not settle for Belgium. He wanted a colony. And he would stop at nothing to make one. By the 1870s, Leopold had become obsessed, not with governance, nor diplomacy, nor the welfare of his people, but with conquest. He masked it with noble phrases, philanthropy, civilization, Christian duty, but behind the facade was pure, predatory ambition. He created the International African Association, a grand-sounding organization cloaked in benevolence, yet hollow with deceit. Through explorers like Henry Morton Stanley, he carved his way into the Congo basin, making treaties with unsuspecting chiefs, promising protection, peace, partnership. But in truth, Leopold was laying chains. By 1885, he had duped the world. The Berlin Conference, where Europe divided Africa like cake slices, handed him personal control over a vast territory 76 times the size of Belgium. It was not a colony of the Belgian state. No, Leopold owned it himself. The Congo Free State, they called it. Free in name only. There were no parliaments, no oversight, no eyes to see what was done. The jungle became a prison. Leopold's agents ruled with the gun and the whip. Entire villages were forced to gather wild rubber under impossible quotas. And when they failed, punishments were inflicted with methodical cruelty: hostage-taking, floggings, executions. Hands were severed not as metaphor, but as record. One hand per bullet fired. A grotesque arithmetic of terror. It is estimated that 10 million souls may have died beneath Leopold's ghostly rule. 10 million. And all the while, in Brussels, the king walked among his gardens, entertained foreign dignitaries, encountered his prophets. He built monuments, museums, triumphal arches, all paid for in Congolese blood. He never once set foot in the land he owned. But even masks, finely crafted as they are, cannot hold forever. Whispers grew into voices. Missionaries, travelers, journalists, they returned with stories. Horrors too vivid to ignore. Among them, a British diplomat named Roger Casement, who documented the crimes with grim detail, and the American writer E.D. Morel, who exposed the lethal trade in rubber and ivory. A tide of public outrage crested across Europe and America. By 1908, the pressure became too great. Leopold, cornered by his own reputation, was forced to surrender the Congo to the Belgian state. But he made sure to extract every last franc before he let it go. He burned records, destroyed archives, tried to erase the evidence. He died the following year, in 1909, hated by many, mourned by few. Crowds jeered as his funeral carriage passed. The bells rang, but they sounded hollow. And so ends the reign of King Leopold II, one of the worst kings in all of history. Not for battles lost or laws failed, but for an empire built upon suffering, for a kingdom he never saw, ruled by terror from afar. A king without a crown in the land he called his own. A man who looked at a continent and saw not people, but prophet, and who left behind a silence that still echoes, like a lullaby twisted into a requiem. Charles I of England. A king born beneath a crown already trembling. He entered the world not as heir, but as sparer, a quiet second son, stammering and frail, overshadowed by a father disinterested, and a brother destined for the throne. Yet fate, as it so often does in history's darker tales, reshuffled the pieces, and so the shy boy, who could hardly speak without faltering, was called to rule a kingdom he never truly understood. Tonight, dear dreamer, we drift back through mist and smoke, to a time when the divine right of kings was whispered like prayer, and the silence between monarch and people grew dangerous and deep. So settle in. Let the past draw its velvet curtain, and listen, gently now, to the slow unraveling of King Charles I. He was crowned in 1625, crowned not only with gold and ermine, but with expectation, with the ghosts of Tudor glory clinging to every corner of his court. He believed, without question, that God had chosen him to rule, and in this belief, unyielding, absolute, lay the seed of his undoing. Charles did not shout. He did not rage. He ruled with silence, with distance, with the calm arrogance of one who believes himself above all question. Where his father had filled rooms with laughter and lust, Charles filled them with art and ceremony. He adored beauty. He collected paintings. He rebuilt churches. And he married a French Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria, a choice that darkened public sentiment like a gathering storm to the Protestant people of England. It was a betrayal to the Parliament, a threat. He dismissed their concerns with a royal wave when they refused him money, He dissolved them, again and again, until at last, he ruled alone, 11 years. They would call it the personal rule. But behind the tidy phrase was the bitter truth of a monarch unbound, taxing without consent, arresting without cause, listening only to flatterers. In the echo of his own certainty, his agents enforced harsh laws. His archbishop silenced dissent from the pulpit. And through it all, Charles watched him passively, like a man staring into a mirror, rather than into the soul of his kingdom. But silence cannot last forever. And when he stretched his hand toward Scotland, seeking to impose his will upon their church, they rose. Then Ireland. Then, inevitably, England. In 1642, the war he could not imagine became the war he could not escape. Father against son, brother against brother, the English Civil War. Charles led his forces with that same cold confidence, believing until the very end that he could not lose, though, that kings do not fall. But fall he did, captured, tried, judged, by his own people, by a court that dared speak a truth once unthinkable. That a king could be guilty, not only of failure, but of crime. He stood before them, calm as ever, still cloaked in the illusion of divine right, still refusing to recognize the court's authority, still unable to comprehend how deeply he had been abandoned. On a cold January morning in 1649, he walked through a window at Whitehall Palace, climbed the scaffold, and laid his neck upon the block. He wore 2 shirts, so he would not shiver from cold, and appear afraid. The axe fell, and in that single stroke, the age of kings trembled. For the first time in English history, a monarch was executed by his own subjects, a divine king, reduced to a body, still and headless in the snow. His blood was caught in handkerchiefs by those who believed him a martyr, but others, far more, breathed a quiet sigh of justice and turned away. The monarchy was abolished, the throne empty, the silence of his reign echoing now through a nation that had endured its breaking point. Charles I ruled not with fire or fury, but with distance, with pride, with a faith so absolute it blinded him. He was not evil, not cruel, but he was incapable of compromise, deaf to the cry of the people, and loyal only to the illusion of kingship. And in the end, his downfall was not sudden, but slow, a long, unraveling thread, pulled tight by stubbornness and solitude. He is remembered not for glory, but for silence, for the kingdom he lost, for the war he summoned, by refusing to listen. Emperor young of sway, he was born into a dynasty still warm with promise, a realm freshly forged by iron will and long-sought unity. His name was Yang Guang, later known to history, with a shiver and a sigh, as Emperor Yang of Sui. Tonight, dear dreamer, we drift far east, to ancient China, to a time when rivers bore grain and soldiers carved empires with their boots. A time when one man, brilliant, proud, and ruinous, rose to inherit everything, and lost it all. So close your eyes. Let us step softly into the shadowed halls of the Sui dynasty, and listen to the fall of a crown heavy with ambition. Born in 569, Yang Guang was the second son of Emperor Wen, the founder of the Sui dynasty, a man of strict Confucian values and meticulous governance. The empire he built was one of rare unity after centuries of warring states, a fragile peace sealed by blood, bureaucracy, and boundless toil. Yang Guang, however, was no ordinary prince. Gifted in letters, graceful in courtly manners, and disarmingly charming, he seemed, to many, the ideal heir. But beneath the silk of civility stirred a colder wind, ambition dressed in filial robes, cunning behind the curtain of Confucian virtue. He flattered, maneuvered, and removed rivals with patient precision. When his elder brother, the rightful heir, fell from grace, some say pushed by Yang's schemes, the path to the throne cleared like reeds cut from a riverbank. Emperor Wen died soon after, suddenly and mysteriously. Whispers accused the son of hastening the father's last breath. In 604, Yang Guang ascended as Emperor Yang of Sui. He inherited an empire unified, but not yet secure. What followed would test the very seams of the nation, and tear them apart. The new emperor's rule unfurled in spectacles, grander, taller, longer. His vision was imperial in scale, like the phoenix-shaped palaces he ordered to rise from the earth, or the monumental Grand Canal, stitched through the land with the sweat of millions. He moved the capital. He built cities. He expanded the canal system to link grain-rich south with the northern seats of power. These achievements, even today, are regarded with awe. But at what cost? For each stone raised, lives were lowered into the dust. The projects drained the treasury. The labor demand crushed the people. Farmers became conscripts, slaves to imperial dreams, their fields left fallow, their homes abandoned. Famine followed. Rebellion brewed. Still, Yang pressed on. He yearned to expand the empire beyond even his father's reach. Korea became an obsession. In a series of brutal campaigns, he sent hundreds of thousands across the sea and into the mountains of Goguryeo. The losses were staggering, not just in battle, but in morale, in loyalty, and soul. Soldiers froze or starved. Entire armies were swallowed by foreign soil. The emperor returned in defeat, cloaked not in triumph, but delusion. He refused to see the cracks in his crown. While his empire bled, Yang turned inward, toward luxury, toward isolation. He surrounded himself with opulence and concubines, while provinces burned and officials plotted in hushed tones. His face grew soft with pleasure, his grip on reality, brittle as frost. By the 610s, China was boiling with discontent. Bandits grew into armies. Peasants became rebels. The Yellow River, burdened with both flood and fury, became a symbol of the broken mandate. Yang grew paranoid. He fled the northern capital to the south, hoping to escape the spreading unrest. He wandered between palaces while rebellion swept across the empire like wildfire in dry grass. In 618, the end came not from a grand battle, but from within his own ranks. A trusted general, tired of the madness, betrayed him. In a remote palace in Jiangdu, far from the northern cradle of his dynasty, Emperor Yang was strangled to death by his own guards. He died alone, unburied, discarded like a fallen idol. The Sui dynasty, barely 37 years old, crumbled with him. And from its ashes rose the Tang. History remembers Yang Guang as a paradox, a visionary of canals and conquest, yet blind to the suffering beneath his throne. A poet-emperor who could recite classics by candlelight, and yet order the deaths of thousands without a blank. He built wonders, and buried his dynasty beneath them. Perhaps the weight of greatness proved too heavy. Perhaps his thirst for glory drowned out the echoes of wisdom. Or perhaps, like so many rulers before and after, he simply forgot the faces of those who carried his dreams. And so the name of Emperor Yang of Sui joins the solemn procession of kings who rose too far, too fast, and fell into silence. Bokassa I of Central Africa. a name once shouted from golden thrones and etched into silk banners. A name that dressed itself in imperial robes and crowned itself with diamonds. A name now whispered with unease, as if history itself is trying not to wake the ghosts. Tonight, dear dreamer, we descend into the fevered heart of Central Africa, into the echoing marble halls of a self-made emperor, where absurdity wore a crown and tyranny paraded through mirrored chambers. Let the world fall away. Let your breath slow. Let us drift back to the moment a man chose to become more than king. To become a god in gold. He was born Jean Bedel Bokassa in 1921, beneath the shadow of the French tricolor. His early years were a theater of trauma. His father, a tribal chief, was arrested by colonial forces and died in custody. His mother, in despair, took her own life. Orphaned, he was raised in Catholic missions and taught discipline under French colonial rule. Like many sons of empire, he turned toward the military, enlisting in the French army. He served in Indochina, in Algeria, bearing witness to distant wars and colonial violence. He rose through the ranks not by brilliance, but by brute loyalty, a soldier first, always seeking the favor of higher men. When independence came to the Central African Republic in 1960, Bokassa returned a decorated veteran. His cousin, David Dacko, took the presidency and, in a gesture of familial trust, or perhaps short-sighted pride, appointed Bokassa head of the army. But behind that toothy grin and military cap, Bokassa's ambition seethed. He was not content to serve. He wanted to rule. And in December of 1965, as the country slept under the watch of Christmas lights, Bokassa struck. Tanks rolled through the streets of Bangui. By dawn, Dacko had vanished, and Bokassa had seized power. There was no revolution, no ideology, only a man in uniform who decided that he could. For a time, he styled himself as father of the nation, firm, theatrical, and erratic. His speeches wandered through promises and threats. He renamed the months of the calendar after himself and his family. He imposed mandatory school uniforms, manufactured by a company owned by his wife. His paranoia grew, and with it, the walls around his palace thickened, glistening with imported marble and Italian chandeliers. But this was not the pinnacle. No, the madness reached its zenith in 1977, when Bokassa crowned himself emperor of the Central African Empire, a nation too impoverished to feed its children, yet now expected to kneel before a throne of velvet and gold. Inspired by Napoleon, he staged a coronation that cost nearly a third of the national budget. Over 500 horses were flown in. His robes weighed over 30 kilograms. He placed the imperial crown upon his own head, a massive diadem of gold, encrusted with rubies and diamonds, as an orchestra played fanfares to a dream that was never real. The world watched, some with horror, others with laughter. But for his people, there was no comedy, only fear. Reports filtered out, whispers of mass arrests, torture chambers beneath the palace, and in time, something darker. In 1979, schoolchildren protested rising food prices and the mandatory uniforms. Bokassa ordered a brutal crackdown. Over 100 children disappeared. Later, their bodies were discovered, dumped into rivers, buried in mass graves. Some, it was claimed, were killed by his own hands. Even France, his longtime patron, could no longer look away. In the dead of night, French paratroopers arrived under Operation Barracuda. Bokassa fled into exile, escaping with millions in state funds, hidden in Swiss vaults and Parisian apartments. The emperor who crowned himself now shuffled from hotel to hotel, muttering grievances, dreaming of return. But return he did. In 1986, deluded or defiant, he flew back to the Central African Republic, believing he'd be welcomed as a messiah. Instead, he was arrested upon arrival. The trial was long, the charges grotesque: murder, treason, cannibalism. He denied everything, claiming he was the 13th apostle of Christ, divinely sent to rule Africa. Though sentenced to death, his punishment was commuted. He died a free man in 1996, old, isolated, and still insisting he had been right. There was no empire, no glory, only silence. And yet, the marble from his palace still cracks beneath the jungle's weight. The golden throne sits cold. The children never came home. So what makes a king truly terrible? Is it the blood he spills, or the vanity he drapes in gold? Is it the madness that poisons his reason, or the silence of those who let him reign? Bokassa I was not merely cruel. He was absurd. A tragedy painted in carnival colors. A soldier who became a king who became an emperor, and an emperor who became a ghost. History remembers his coronation, but it mourns what was lost beneath it, the lives, the dignity, the truth. And so we leave him now, alone in his marble tomb of forgotten dreams. Ivan the Terrible. A name like the thunderclap of distant war drums, echoing across the frozen forest of old Rus. A name whispered through the ages with fear, confusion, and mournful awe. He was the first to take the title Tsar, yet ruled more like a god unchained, or a man unraveling by candlelight. His life, grand in ambition, tragic in consequence, unfolded like a fevered prayer scratched into the walls of a monastery. So come now, gentle listener, let us drift together through the mist of time, to a land of golden domes and groaning bells, where winter never ends, and mercy rarely lived. Let us remember the reign of Ivan IV, the Terrible. He was born in 1530, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Kremlin, while Moscow sat quiet in the cold breath of autumn. Yet Ivan's childhood was anything but still. By the age of 3, he wore the crown of Grand Prince. And by 8, he was an orphan in all but name. His father dead of poison, his mother dead of poison or power, no one could say. In the shadowed halls of court, young Ivan wandered, half prince, half prisoner, watched over not by guardians, but by rival boyars, noble families who pulled the strings of power like puppeteers with trembling hands. There, in that grim and golden childhood, the seeds of terror were sown. Neglect turned to cruelty, and cruelty to obsession. Ivan learned to read in Latin and Greek, to speak of God and Caesar, and also to throw cats from towers and tear feathers from birds. He dreamed of Rome and apocalypse, of holy mission and violent revenge. Even as a child, he watched the world burn in his mind's eye, and waited, patiently, to make it real. At 16, he crowned himself Tsar of all Rus, a title no prince had taken before. The coronation shimmered with sacred fire. Bells rang, and scents curled like breath from the mouth of heaven, and Ivan knelt, not before God, but as if becoming him. For Ivan believed he ruled by divine right, no man above him, no check upon his will. And so began the slow, spiraling descent. At first, he was beloved, a reformer, a visionary. He rewrote the law codes, founded a standing army, reached out to distant lands. But the old demons were never far. Death returned in waves. His beloved first wife, Anastasia, poisoned, perhaps by nobles, perhaps not. But Ivan believed it. And when she died, something inside him cracked like ice beneath a heavy foot. He left Moscow for the countryside, abandoning the throne, only to return, on his own terms. He demanded absolute power, and the people, weary of chaos, granted it. Thus was born the Opera Nina, a reign of terror within a reign. He dressed in black robes, rode a black horse, flanked by a secret police who carried dog heads and brooms, symbols of sniffing out traitors and sweeping them away. Cities were sacked, entire populations tortured or relocated. Novgorod, a proud city of old, was punished for imagined treason. Thousands were drowned in icy rivers or impaled on spikes. The snow turned red and did not melt for weeks. Ivan wrote letters, long, rambling, spiritual treatises to justify the blood. He saw himself as both executioner and saint. His power was absolute, his madness methodical. And then came his most terrible act. In a fit of rage, he struck his eldest son, his heir, his pride, his mirror with the staff. The young man fell, skull broken, blood pooling. Ivan collapsed beside the body, wailing, clutching the boy's lifeless form. He had destroyed his future with his own hand. After that, Ivan was never the same. His face, once broad and commanding, became a mask of illness and sorrow. He aged quickly, hounded by visions, illness, and regret. His remaining son, Fyodor, was gentle but weak, a pale reflection of a shattered dynasty. The Tsardom limped forward, but the heart of Russia had cracked. Ivan died in 1584 while playing chess. Some say he was poisoned again, that word, but it hardly mattered. Death came like a long-lost companion, at last. His country descended into the time of troubles, a name as haunting as his own. Famine, war, impostors, foreign invasion, all seemed to follow in his wake. He left behind churches and chronicles, palaces and prisons, a vision of Russia as vast and powerful and ruled by fear. He had dreamed of a holy empire and built a haunted one. What remains of him now? A painting of a father cradling his dying son. A legend soaked in ice and blood. A name. Grozny, the Terrible. So sleep now, dear listener, knowing that even the most powerful men are made of fragile flesh, that even kings who claim divine right cannot escape the weight of their own sorrow. Ivan IV ruled like thunder, but left only echoes. He built an empire and burned his own name into its soil. Not with glory, but with grief. A caution not just for rulers, but for all who mistake fear for strength and pain for purpose. Let the bells of old Moscow fade into the distance. Let the snow fall soft across the silent domes. King Farouk of Egypt. Born into a throne wrapped in silk and shadow, he entered the world not as a man, but as a promise, a gilded heir to the ancient pharaohs, destined, perhaps, to lift a fading empire into modern light. But history, ever the patient observer, watched instead as promise rotted into excess, and a boy king devoured by his appetites crumbled beneath the weight of a golden crown. So close your eyes and drift backward to a land of sand, sea, and secrets. To Cairo's golden dusk, and the boy who would become the last true king of Egypt. He was only 16. In the year 1936, the sudden death of King Fuad thrust the shy, chubby-cheeked Farouk into power far too soon. Still a student in England, he returned to Egypt draped in grief and robes of monarchy. The people, weary from colonial rule and foreign interference, looked upon the boy with cautious hope. He was young, Egyptian-born, and carried the blood of Muhammad Ali Pasha, the dynasty's founder. Perhaps, just perhaps, he would be different. At first, he played the part of the reformer, a modern monarch, a man of the people. His speeches were laced with patriotism, his image broadcast from every corner. He promised a brighter Egypt. But behind palace walls, the boy struggled, isolated, indulged, haunted by insecurity and grandeur. He became obsessed with his appearance, with his waistline, with being perceived as regal. But the mirror was cruel, and the court whispered. So, he turned to food, then to women, then to gambling, then to trinkets. Power, to him, became a fortress of distraction. He collected thousands of watches, rare coins, and fine Italian suits. At his most grotesque, he would eat entire banquets alone in one sitting, devouring plates of roast meats, cakes, and candies while the nation outside starved. He hunted exotic animals by moonlight. He bought luxury cars by the dozen. He drank and danced and chased actresses through the marble halls of the Abdeen Palace. And all the while, Egypt waited and watched. Then came the fire. January 26, 1952. Cairo burned. It began with riots, sparked by a clash between Egyptian police and British forces. But what ignited was something deeper. Years of corruption, foreign domination, poverty, and the slow decay of a dynasty that had forgotten its people. Angry mobs stormed the streets. Cinemas, shops, and hotels were engulfed in flames. Black smoke curled into the sky like a warning. And where was the king? Farouk, bloated and drunk, played poker aboard his royal yacht. When informed of the riots, he shrugged, poured another drink, and returned to his cards. It was the moment the people turned. No longer amused by the antics of their monarch, they now saw him clearly. Not as a ruler, but as a parasite feasting upon the corpse of a dying kingdom. The army, too, grew restless. And in July of that same year, it came for him. A group of young officers led by General Muhammad Naguib and a little-known colonel named Gamal Abdel Nasser staged a coup. There was no bloodshed, no glorious defense. Just a letter, cold, brief, final, demanding Farouk abdicate in favor of his infant son, Fuad II. Shocked, humiliated, and suddenly sober, Farouk boarded his royal yacht once more, this time not for pleasure, but exile. As he sailed away across the Mediterranean, the world watched the fall of the last king of Egypt. The monarchy was abolished the next year. The pharaohs, at last, were gone. In exile, Farouk became a tragic parody of himself. He drifted from Rome to Capri, living off his fortune, still pretending to be regal. He grew larger still, some said over 300 pounds, his belly spilling over fine Italian tailoring, his fingers glittering with rings he could no longer remove. He told stories, grand, unbelievable lies, that he had been overthrown by the British, that he would one day return, that he was still king. But he wasn't. He was a relic, bloated by indulgence, consumed by nostalgia. A ghost with no kingdom. He died in 1965, collapsing at a restaurant table in Rome after a gluttonous meal. His heart, long strained, gave way mid-bite. Even in death, he was grotesque. His body was flown back to Cairo, quietly buried with none of the grandeur he'd once demanded. The people did not mourn. Farouk's tale is not one of tyranny in the traditional sense. He was no blood-soaked tyrant, no cunning Machiavellian ruler. His was a softer, sadder descent, into waste, into shame, into self-destruction. He ruled not with iron but with appetite, and in doing so, allowed a kingdom to rot under his gaze. A symbol of opulence in a time of hardship. A man who played at kingship while the world burned below. What is the weight of a crown when it rests on an empty life? History remembers him not with anger, but with weary disappointment. He could have been more, but he was less. King Faisal II of Iraq. A boy wrapped in silk, born into a crown built on sand. A king not by conquest or cunning, but by blood, cold and royal, spilled before his time. His was a life shaped not by deeds, but by decisions made in rooms he could not enter, by shadows cast long before he stood in the light. In the twilight of empires, as the last flickers of monarchy dimmed in the Arab world, Faisal became a symbol, not of grandeur, but of fragility. So lie back now, dear listener, and drift with me through the waning embers of Iraq's Hashemite dream, a bedtime story of fragile thrones, ticking clocks, and a crown that grew too heavy for the boy beneath it. Faisal was born in 1935, in the royal palace of Baghdad, his cries echoing through tiled corridors still clinging to their Ottoman past. His father, King Ghazi, ruled with a reckless hand, a young monarch obsessed with cars, nationalism, and resisting British oversight. But fate is swift with such men. A car crash in 1939, convenient to some, suspicious to many, left Ghazi lifeless, his body broken, in the kingdom without a grown king. At just 3 years old, Faisal was crowned in name, but ruled in absence. His uncle, Prince Abd al-Ilah, assumed the regency, and the kingdom drifted further under the shadow of British influence. The child king played with soldiers carved of wood while real ones marched through the capital. The regency years were a theater of contradiction. While Faisal learned to write his name in gilded notebooks, Iraq was tangled in revolt, oil disputes, and the bloody echoes of World War II. Nationalists whispered of independence. Clerics called for unity. British officers ensured neither would succeed too fully. As Faisal grew, so too did the discontent beneath his throne. Sent to England for his education, he was polished like fine silver, Etonian manners, a princely stride, a distant accent that alienated him from his own people. He returned to Iraq in 1953, a young man of 18, suddenly king in more than name. But what kind of king? A foreign-grown flower planted in restless soil. The 1950s were years of tremors across the Middle East. Monarchies, once protected by Western steel, found themselves vulnerable to the voices rising from alleyways and army barracks. Egypt had shed its king. Syria wobbled between coups. Iraq was next. Faisal's rule was indecisive, marked not by tyranny, but by tragic passivity. He leaned heavily on his cousin and regent-turned-advisor, Abd al-Ilah, and the iron-fisted Prime Minister Nuri al-Said. These were men of the old world, staunch pro-Westerners, loyal to oil deals and quiet diplomacy with colonial ghosts. But the world was changing faster than they could imagine. The people spoke not in royal decrees but in slogans, scrawled on crumbling walls, "Down with the monarchy. Down with foreign chains." Faisal watched, impotent, as the winds of revolution howled louder. The 1955 Baghdad Pact, a Western alliance against Soviet influence, further alienated his people. They no longer saw a monarch. They saw a puppet. Still, the young king smiled at ceremonies, cut ribbons, and walked the palace gardens. Perhaps he believed he could hold the kingdom together with grace. Or perhaps he knew. The tide had already turned. The end came not with thunder, but with gunfire at dawn. On July 14, 1958, army officers led by General Abdul Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdul Salam Arif marched into Baghdad under the guise of moving troops to Jordan. Instead, they turned on the capital. The royal palace, Al-Rihab, awoke to chaos. Faisal, just 23, was rushed to the courtyard with his uncle, his servants, and palace staff. No plea could soften the rage. No title could shield them. The firing squad was swift. Bullets tore through royal flesh, through centuries of Hashemite rule. The king, the boy monarch, fell to the ground, still dressed in the white of mourning, his hands bound, his eyes wide. His body, riddled and lifeless, was left in the street for all to see. Dignity stripped, monarchy shattered. His blood ran through Baghdad's gutters, and with it, the dream of a Western-backed Arab kingdom. Faisal II was not evil, nor cruel, nor monstrous. He was unready, unwilling, unfortunate. His reign was one of absence, his rule a quiet echo behind louder men. He lived in a palace of glass, never realizing how close the cracks had come. His was not the tyranny of iron, but the tragedy of fragility. And so, he remains one of history's worst kings, not by the weight of his crimes, but by the lightness of his legacy. A king without a kingdom, a throne without roots, a life without the chance to rule in his own right. Charles II of Spain, a name whispered with pity through the marble corridors of Europe, and spoken with dread behind the heavy velvet curtains of Madrid. Born beneath the weight of 1,000 royal ancestors, he entered the world not with promise, but with portent, a frail, trembling child who would one day inherit an empire too vast for his withered hands, and too broken for his broken body. Tonight, dear dreamer, let us step softly into the faded halls of the Spanish Habsburg court, where gold gleamed on the surface, but rot festered underneath. Let us drift slowly through the twilight of a dying dynasty, where one king's suffering mirrored the downfall of an empire. So close your eyes, take a breath as deep as time, and let history unfold in hushed tones. He was born on a cold November night in 1661, the long-awaited heir to King Philip IV and Queen Mariam of Austria. But Charles II was no ordinary prince. Even at birth, it was clear something was terribly wrong. His tongue was too large for his mouth. His jaw jutted forward in the grotesque Habsburg mold. He could not walk until he was 4. He could not speak until he was nearly 8. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, and to many, that seemed the only explanation for his pitiable state. His body was twisted, his intellect stunted, his fertility doubtful. But the truth, of course, was no spell at all. Only the brutal arithmetic of generations of incest, carefully arranged in the name of dynastic purity. By the time Charles was crowned king at the tender age of 3, Spain was already unraveling. The once mighty empire, flush with silver and swollen with pride, had grown sluggish and hollow. Its coffers were drained by endless wars. Its people suffered under famine, disease, and the weight of a decadent court that refused to see the truth. And in the midst of it all sat Charles, haunted eyes beneath a heavy brow, fragile as porcelain, ruled more than ruling, a child puppet held aloft by the fingers of scheming ministers and clawing favorites. As he aged, he did not ripen, he withered. His mind remained clouded, easily swayed, prone to suspicion, prone to melancholy. He grew obsessed with witches, with curses, with the dark arts that might explain his own misfortune. His court became a theater of superstition, where exorcists replaced advisors, and the king's bedchamber stank of burnt incense and whispered prayers. Though he was married twice, Charles never fathered an heir. His body, riddled with illness, seemed incapable of producing life. Doctors prodded him, priests warned of divine punishment, and his queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, prayed in vain beside his sickbed. The Habsburg line, once the pride of Christendom, was dying with him. And still the empire bled. Revolts in Naples, starvation in Castile, defeat after defeat on foreign fields. Spain had become a crumbling cathedral, beautiful in form but hollow in soul. And a king, poor Charles, was its ghostly caretaker, unable to save it, unable even to save himself. In the final years of his life, Charles became a walking relic. He lost his teeth. He lost his vision. His body bloated and twisted further, and his mind slipped into a fog of paranoia and spiritual terror. He believed he was cursed. He believed his enemies had stolen his essence. And perhaps, in a way, they had. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II died at the age of 38. The autopsy report, read in stunned silence, listed his body as wasted and decayed. His heart was said to be the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines blackened, his brain filled with water. And yet, his death was not his alone. It was the death of a dynasty. With no heir to take the throne, Europe plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape borders, ruin nations, and end forever the Habsburg reign in Spain. The long lineage of kings with jutting jaws and devout Catholicism had ended not with a bang, but with a whisper, drowned in shadows and incense. And Charles, poor, tragic Charles, became not a figure of rage or tyranny, but of sorrow, a monarch whose suffering came not from cruelty, but from being born into a legacy of too much blood shared, and not enough wisdom. So as the candle gutters low, and the ghost of Charles II wanders the halls of the Escorial and dreams, we remember him not as a villain, but as a victim of history's cold hand. His rule was one of stillness, of waiting, for death, for salvation, for something to break the cycle. He was a king in title, but a prisoner in truth, of genetics, of fate, of the crushing machinery of empire. Let his story be a whisper in your sleep, a soft sigh of the past warning us of what happens when pride blinds reason, and when bloodlines run too deep for their own good. Christian VII of Denmark, a king in name, but not in will, not in mind, not in heart. Born into opulence on January 29, 1749, in the gilded halls of Copenhagen, Christian entered the world as heir to the Danish-Norwegian throne, a child of destiny, yes, but also of dysfunction. His father, King Frederick V, drank himself into stupors, while his mother drifted between melancholy and detachment. From the very beginning, Christian's world was a cold place, even inside the warmth of palaces. As a boy, he was small, pale, and often sick. A nervous twitch marked his expressions, and his tutors would whisper about emotional fits, wild mood swings, and long silences broken only by eerie laughter. By today's light, we might see signs of schizophrenia or profound developmental trauma. But in the 18th century, he was simply odd, fragile, unstable, and destined to wear a crown he could scarcely carry. Christian ascended the throne at just 17, following the death of his father in 1766. The coronation was ceremonial, its gravity lost on a boy more interested in toys than treaties. His court, lavish and gaudy, became a theater of cruelty and indulgence. Christian would perform violent pranks on his servants, burst into hysterics during council meetings, and disappear into fits of wild behavior that his physicians struggled to contain. He starved himself. He beat his dog. He mutilated himself with knives. The court whispered, and Denmark trembled. A king so delicate in mind could not possibly steer a nation. But behind every weak king is someone eager to pull the strings. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician with Enlightenment ideals and silver-tongued charm. Struensee became Christian's personal doctor in 1768. Within a year, he held the true power of the kingdom. He administered not only medicine, but policy, acting as puppet master to a hollow king. Under his shadow, reforms blossomed. Censorship was eased, torture abolished, smallpox vaccinations spread across the land. Denmark, for a brief and strange moment, found itself bathed in rational light. But reason is never safe in a court thick with tradition, and shadows grow quickly behind bright flames. Struensee had grown too bold. He had seduced not just the kingdom, but the queen herself. Caroline Matilda, Christian's young British wife, found in Struensee the intellect and tenderness her husband lacked. Their affair became the court's worst-kept secret. And so, the whispering grew into plots. In 1772, a cold January night, the palace doors burst open. Struensee was seized. Caroline was dragged from her bed. And Christian VII? He barely understood what was happening. The trial was swift and brutal. Struensee, once savior, was now traitor. Beheaded, drawn, quartered. His reforms were torn down like scaffolding around a crumbling monument. Caroline was exiled to a lonely castle in Hanover, never to see her children again. And Christian was left to drift. For the next 4 decades, Christian VII reigned in name only. His body remained king, but his mind had long since abdicated. Others ruled for him, first his stepmother, then ministers, finally his own son. He would wander the palace corridors muttering nonsense, sometimes playing with dolls, sometimes dancing to invisible music. A living ghost, haunted by memories he could not grasp. His country moved on, but he could not. He died in 1808, at the age of 59, a king who never truly lived. So what becomes of a kingdom ruled by a broken soul? Christian VII reminds us that a crown cannot mend what is already shattered, that power without clarity is a burden, not a gift. He was not evil. He was not cruel by design. But he was a boy placed upon a throne too soon, and too alone. And in the quiet hollows of his reign, Denmark learned the dangers of a crown that gleams, but is hollow within. Sleep now, dear dreamer, and let the weight of crowns and centuries drift quietly away. Let the storm pass. Let the candles dim. Gyanendra of Nepal, a name carved into the final chapter of a 1,000-year-old monarchy. A man born a king, crowned in childhood, dethroned by fate, and returned by tragedy, only to oversee the slow unraveling of a kingdom. His story is not one of triumph, nor of valiant failure, but of silence, suspicion, and the quiet death of a royal line beneath the weight of its own illusions. So settle in now, dear listener. Let the day drift away as we step into the shadowed corridors of palaces perched in the clouds, and listen to the haunting tale of the last king of the Himalayas, and perhaps one of the worst. The Himalayan kingdom of Nepal had long been a tapestry of myth and monarchy. For centuries, kings ruled not merely as men, but as incarnations of gods. In the sacred city of Kathmandu, the palace gleamed with golden roofs and ancient ritual. The people bowed not to politicians, but to a bloodline, said to be divinely chosen. Into this world, Gyanendra was born in 1947, second son of King Mahendra, a spare in the line of succession, unlikely to rule. And yet, the wheel of fortune turned oddly. At the age of 3, he became king for the first time. His grandfather killed in an Indian palace, his father exiled during a political crisis. For a brief, bewildering moment, the toddler was king of Nepal. But the crown was taken back as quickly as it had been placed. His father returned. His brother Birendra would later become king, and Gyanendra would live in the long, lengthening shadow of royal greatness he could never quite claim, until the unthinkable happened. The year was 2001. Nepal was a fragile state, teetering between the old and the new. The Maoist insurgency raged across the countryside. Democracy had been introduced in name, but the palace still clung to power, and ancient feuds festered beneath the silks of ceremony. Then, on a June night in the royal palace, gunfire shattered the sacred silence. Crown Prince Dipendra, intoxicated, enraged, possibly deranged, took an assault rifle and massacred his own family. The king, the queen, the prince's brother and sister, courtiers, guards, one by one, in a scene too surreal to believe, a royal dinner became a bloodbath. Dipendra then turned the gun on himself. But for 3 days, as he lay in a coma, the nation still called him king. A monarch in a hospital bed, a ghostly ruler, fading. And then, only then, did the crown pass to Gyanendra. He, who had lost a brother and sister-in-law. He, who was not present that night. He, who had survived. From the moment he ascended, doubt clung to him like smoke. Why was Gyanendra not at the dinner that night? Why had his son Para survived? Why did the palace refuse an open investigation? The people whispered. Rumors curled through Kathmandu like incense. That Gyanendra had known, had plotted, had waited. There was no proof, only shadows. But the silence of the palace was deafening. Still, the throne was his. And with it, came choices. Instead of healing the nation, Gyanendra clutched power ever tighter. He dismissed parliament, suspended civil liberties, declared himself an absolute monarch once more, as though time itself could be reversed. The dream of democracy drowned beneath curfews and censorship. Journalists vanished. Protesters were beaten in the streets. The king, once a symbol of divine harmony, became a specter of control. The people, weary from war and grief, began to rise. And they did not rise for him. In April 2006, the streets of Nepal erupted. Students, teachers, farmers, monks, they marched in defiance of the king's rule. For 19 days, they filled the boulevards with chants and banners. They were met with tear gas, batons, and bullets. But they did not break. And under the weight of this movement, Gyanendra fell. He was forced to restore parliament, stripped of his powers. And 2 years later, in 2008, the monarchy was formally abolished. A 1,000-year-old lineage gone. The royal standard lowered. The palace converted to a museum. Gyanendra, the last king, left through a side door. No crowds, no procession, no farewell. Just a man, carrying his own suitcase, stepping into a republic that no longer believed in crowns. Today, Gyanendra lives quietly. Sometimes he speaks of returning, of restoring the throne. But the world has moved on. Nepal has changed. And history has judged him not only as the final monarch, but perhaps as the one who lost a kingdom not to invasion, nor to fate, but to pride, misrule, and mistrust. He did not inherit a broken crown. He broke it himself. So let his tale be a warning, etched in twilight. Even kings, born to rule, may fall to silence if they refuse to listen. Mengistu Haile Mariam, a name whispered in the shadows of Ethiopia's haunted past, heavy with the sin of blood and the smoke of revolution. Not a king by title, but a ruler in the truest, most terrible sense, a man who sees the crown of a crumbling empire, only to become the architect of a modern reign of terror. And so tonight, dear listener, as the world outside quiets and your room falls still, we step gently into a chapter etched not in gold, but in ash. Let us walk slowly into the deepening dusk of 20th century Africa, where dreams of liberation curdled into nightmares, and a soldier with a clenched fist came to embody a nation's darkest hour. Breathe deeply, and let the story begin. In the heart of East Africa, where the ancient kingdom of Abyssinia had once risen proud upon its highland plateaus, the winds of change began to stir. The year was 1974. Emperor Haile Selassie, the Lion of Judah, revered abroad and increasingly reviled at home, faced an empire fraying at the seams. Famine ravaged the north, while whispers of dissent echoed through army barracks and student halls. And among those whispers, marched Mengistu. Born of humble means, the son of a soldier, he bore no princely blood. But what he lacked in pedigree he made up for in ambition and rage. Trained in the Soviet Union, steeped in Marxist dogma, Mengistu returned to Ethiopia with a vision, a radical, blood-ink blueprint for a new world. The monarchy fell swiftly. The Derg, a military junta, seized power in Selassie's absence. And among its many-faced council, one voice grew louder, more forceful, more ruthless, Mengistu's. With cold eyes and iron will, he rose through the ranks, purging rivals like shadows at dawn. Then came the turning point, the act that would darken his legacy beyond redemption. It was 1977. In a crowded hall, before flashing cameras and stone-faced generals, Mengistu threw down empty bottles of red liquid, symbolic blood, upon the stage. A performance, theatrical and horrifying. This is the blood of the imperialists, he declared. And so began Sherber the Red Terror. Night after night, the streets of Addis Ababa were washed with silence, broken only by the rumble of trucks and the screams that never made it past alley walls. Young students, workers, anyone suspected of dissent, disappeared. Bodies were dumped in public squares as warnings. Families were billed for the bullets used to execute their sons and daughters. No one was safe. Not the old, not the young, not even former allies. The revolution devoured its own. The sin of revolution, once brimming with promise, curdled into rot. And Mengistu sat upon the ashes, unflinching. He ruled not with the grace of a king, but with the cold calculus of a man who feared history might forget him, unless he drowned it in red. But tyranny, like all things, has a shelf life. Outside Ethiopia, the world watched in silence or with shrugs. Inside, famine struck again, worse than before. Crops failed, rains withheld their blessing. But Mengistu, ever defiant, diverted aid, silenced reports, and blamed the West. Starvation spread like fire. Millions suffered. And all the while, his iron grip tightened. By the late 1980s, the winds had shifted once more. Rebel groups gained ground. The Soviet Union, Mengistu's lifeline, faltered and fell, and the ghost of justice began to stir. In 1991, As rebel forces neared the capital, Mengistu fled, not in chains, but aboard a plane bound for Zimbabwe. He left behind a crumbling state, 500,000 dead, and a people too exhausted to grieve. From afar, he watched history unfold, unrepentant, untouched. Tried in absentia for genocide, he lives still, an old man in exile. But the memory of him lingers, like a wound that has not quite healed. So what becomes of a king without a crown? Of a tyrant without a tomb? Mengistu Haile Mariam ruled not from a throne, but from fear. And fear, though powerful, is a fragile thing. It burns brightly, briefly, and then dies. Tonight, this story joins the long procession of shadows that stretch behind us. A cautionary tale. A whispered warning. A lesson in what becomes of revolutions that forget their humanity. The earth turns still. The past cannot be undone. But here, beneath the quiet stars, we can remember and reflect. Charles VI of France. They called him Charles the Beloved, before they called him Charles the Mad. A king born in splendor, who drifted into shadows. His reign, a strange waltz of pageantry and paranoia, of velvet robes and broken mirrors. Tonight, dear dreamer, we slip beneath the flickering torchlight of medieval France. Let the winds whisper through the stone corridors of forgotten palaces, and follow the fragile footsteps of a monarch unraveling. So settle in, let your thoughts drift softly from the present, and allow this tale of crowns, curses, and crumbling minds to guide you gently toward sleep. He was crowned in Reims, as tradition demanded, in the glow of stained glass and sacred oil. Just 11 years old, a boy king draped in responsibilities heavier than his crown. His father, King Charles V, had been a steady hand. But death came early, and so the realm passed to a child surrounded by wolves in ermine cloaks. His uncles, the Dukes of Burgundy, Anjou, Berry, and Bourbon, each saw not a nephew, but an opportunity. They drained the treasury with pomp and excess, while the peasants, still aching from the 100 Years' War, whispered of hunger and fate. France, splintered and aching, watched its boy king grow into a man behind walls of gold and deceit. And then, something strange began to flicker behind the king's eyes. Something invisible, yet unmistakable. At first, it was mere forgetfulness. Then a withdrawal. He wandered the halls at night, silent, staring at unseen things. And then came the forest. It was a summer morning in 1392 when the court set out through the forest of Le Mans. The air was warm, the horses restless. They were bound for Brittany, where rebellion stirred. Charles, dressed in finery, rode at the front. Suddenly, a man stepped from the woods, wild-eyed, clutching a staff. He shouted, "King, ride no further. You are betrayed." The king's retinue laughed, brushing it off as madness. But the words, like poison, lodged deep within the monarch's mind. Not long after, under the blaze of the midday sun, Charles froze, then turned. With no warning, no reason, he drew his sword and struck his own men, slashing wildly, screaming, until he was wrestled to the ground, eyes wide with fury and confusion, his mind broken. He would not be the same again. They called it a fit, but it was only the first. In the years to follow, the king would fall deeper into the realm of shadows. At times, he believed he was made of glass. He refused to be touched, fearing he would shatter. He forgot his own name. did not recognize his wife or children. He would rage, then weep. He would wander the Louvre, unwashed, muttering to himself, dressed in rags or robes of gold. And when the madness consumed him, the kingdom was ruled by others. France became a chessboard for the ambitious. The Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, aligned with one faction, the Duke of Orleans with another, and the Duke of Burgundy, clever, calculating, maneuvered between them all. Each claimed to act in the king's name, but the king had no voice. Only vacant stares and sudden outbursts. Civil war erupted. The Armagnacs against the Burgundians, brother against brother, noble against noble, while Charles sat in his palace gardens, naming birds and trees, or hiding behind curtains, whispering to phantoms. And in 1415, the unthinkable, Agincourt, the flower of French nobility, cut down by English arrows. A disaster made possible by a kingdom without a king. And then, in a final twist of tragedy, Charles, lost in one of his deeper spells, was tricked into signing the Treaty of Troyes. In it, he disinherited his own son, and named England's Henry V as heir to France. The madness, at last, had swallowed the future. Charles VI lingered in a twilight world for over 4 decades, sometimes lucid, often lost, a king in title, but in truth a ghost haunting his own reign. When he died in 1422, Paris barely stirred. His body was laid to rest in Saint Denis, beneath the cold marble effigy, a frozen smile carved for a life lived in sorrow. He had ruled for 42 years. Yet how much of that rule was truly his? Ferdinand VII of Spain, a name once spoken with cautious hope, then with bitter contempt, and finally, with weary resignation. He was called the Desired by his people when he first rose to power, and by the end, he was known as the Felon King. So now, dear dreamer, lie back, let the hush of history settle around you, and drift through the shadows of old Spain. Let us remember a king who ended his own kingdom, not through violence or chaos, but by clinging to the past while the future marched on without him. This is the tale of Ferdinand VII, a monarch who promised salvation and delivered sorrow. The story begins in 1784, in the glittering halls of El Escorial. Ferdinand, son of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, was born into power, but also into a court riddled with scandal and manipulation. Even as a child, he watched with wide eyes as the Spanish crown weakened under the growing influence of Manuel Godoy, his mother's favorite, his father's shadow. Spain, once mighty, was now stumbling. Napoleon loomed to the north, and the Bourbon dynasty, aging and brittle, could barely hold its footing. In this turbulent court, Ferdinand grew clever, suspicious, and calculating. He would be the savior, he thought. He would restore Spain to greatness. But greatness would elude him. In 1808, after whispers and conspiracies, after the crowds in Madrid cried for him to take the throne, he ascended, briefly, as king. He was just 24. But Napoleon had other plans. Summoning Ferdinand and his father to Bayonne under the guise of peace, the French emperor trapped them both. There, under pressure, both father and son abdicated. Napoleon installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. Ferdinand was shipped off to Valencia in France. And so, for 6 long years, Spain burned with war, while its desired king sat in comfortable exile, reading, waiting, doing little. While patriots and peasants bled for independence, Ferdinand did not fight. He did not write. He waited. And then he returned. In 1814, with Napoleon defeated and the French ejected, Ferdinand VII marched triumphantly back into Spain. The people cheered. Banners flew. Bells rang out. This, they thought, was the beginning of a new era. But Ferdinand had learned nothing in France and forgotten nothing in Spain. One of his first acts as restored monarch was to abolish the liberal constitution of 1812, a document written in blood and hope during the Peninsular War. It had promised freedom of the press, equality before the law, and the birth of a modern Spanish nation. Ferdinand tore it to pieces. He reinstated absolute monarchy, dismissed the parliament, and launched a brutal wave of repression. Prisons filled. Exiles mounted. Dissidents disappeared. Spain staggered backwards, its wounds from war reopened by the very man hailed as its savior. For 20 years, he ruled erratically, sometimes indulging in reforms, only to recoil and crush them. He trusted no one, feared everyone. Ministers came and went like flickering candles. He played factions against each other, not out of strategy, but out of spite. And all the while, Spain suffered. Its empire crumbled, first in the Americas, where colonies broke free, one by one, in bloody rebellion. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia. By the end, only Cuba and a few outposts remained. Ferdinand lost more land than any monarch in Spanish history. But to Ferdinand, none of that mattered. What mattered was power. What mattered was legacy. And in the final act of his reign, he would twist even that. He had no male heir. His first 3 marriages ended in death and despair, each wife fading from illness, miscarriage, or political poison. Finally, in his 4th marriage, he fathered a daughter, Isabella. But Spain's laws forbade female succession, unless, of course, the king said otherwise. In 1830, Ferdinand issued the Pragmatic Sanction, reinstating an old law that allowed his daughter to inherit. This enraged his younger brother, Don Carlos, who had long had the crown for himself. When Ferdinand died in 1833, bloated and broken at the age of 49, he left behind a fragile throne and a kingdom on the brink. His daughter's reign would ignite the Carlist Wars, a bloody civil conflict that would haunt Spain for decades. Brother against niece, tradition against reform, and all of it, born from the legacy of one man. So, dear listener, as night thickens and candles flicker low, consider the strange cruelty of history. That a man once called the Desired would become the very curse from which Spain could not awaken. He did not conquer nor create. He did not inspire nor enlighten. He simply ruled, and in his ruling, he drained the veins of a nation desperate for breath. He feared the future and embalmed the past. And in doing so, he left his people trapped between ruins and ghosts. Spain would rise again in time. But Ferdinand VII ensured that when it did, it would rise slowly, painfully, dragging the weight of his crown behind it. Tsar Nicholas II, the last crowned monarch of Russia, a man born in a palace of ice and marble, destined for a throne drenched in the blood of centuries. From the moment he inherited the empire, the tides of history began to close in, slow, silent, and unstoppable. He was a man of fine suits, family portraits, and whispered prayers, but also of trembling hands, poor judgment, and fatal indecision. In the end, it was not just the empire that fell, but the myth of divine right, shattered like glass beneath the weight of revolution. So lie back now, dear listener. Let your eyes grow heavy as we drift through cold palaces and flickering candlelight, into the story of the Tsar who ruled when the world turned upside down. Born in 1868, Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov entered a world of splendor and tradition. Heir to the Russian Empire, the largest on earth, he was raised amidst gilded ceilings and the weighty shadows of ancestors. But his heart was gentle, uncertain. He loved his wife, Alexandra, deeply. He adored his children, especially little Alexei, the heir stricken with hemophilia, whose pain haunted the family's halls like a specter. Yet the world beyond the palace gates was shifting. Russia was no longer the medieval stronghold of saints and serfs. The peasants murmured. The workers protested. Modernity crept through the cracks of the empire like a winter wine through broken glass. When Nicholas took the throne in 1894, he was unprepared, unwilling, and tragically blind to what the empire needed. He clung to absolute power, believing it divinely granted. He dismissed the cries for reform, ignored the gathering storms. While Europe modernized, Nicholas dug in his heels, soft-spoken, polite, and devastatingly out of touch. Then came 1905. The first wave. The people marched in peace toward the Winter Palace, and were met with gunfire. Bloody Sunday. The Tsar wasn't even there. But the shots fired in his name rang out across history. The people no longer saw him as their little father. They saw a tyrant, a butcher. And so the dance of disaster began. Then came the war. The Great War. World War I swallowed Europe in fire and steel. Nicholas led his people into it, believing God and country would see them through. But Russian troops died in the millions, ill-equipped, hungry, lost. The front lines were chaos. The home front, starvation. And Nicholas left the capital to take personal command. A gesture of honor, perhaps. But it left the government in the hands of his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, and her dark confidant. Rasputin, the mad monk, the whisperer, the mystic with wild eyes and rumors swirling like black smoke. He whispered into Alexandra's ear, and through her, into the veins of the empire itself. Ministers were replaced. Chaos deepened. And Nicholas? He wrote letters home. He prayed. He clung to the past. By 1917, the dam finally broke. Red riots exploded into full revolution. The army mutinied. The streets of Petrograd became a river of protest. Nicholas, aboard his train, tried to return to the capital, but it was too late. He abdicated the throne, not just for himself, but for his son. The Romanov dynasty was over. 300 years, undone in a moment of ink on paper. Stripped of power, the former Tsar became simply Nicholas Romanov. He and his family were moved from palace to house, from house to prison, from prison to silence. Gone were the court balls and embroidered uniforms. Now came damp walls, rationed bread, and constant surveillance. The children still played. The parents still prayed. But the world outside was growing darker. In July of 1918, in the basement of a modest house in Ekaterinburg, their story came to its end. Awoken in the night, led downstairs, told they were being moved. And then, without trial, without mercy, came the shots. Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the frail young boy, Alexei. All gone. The empire was already in ruins. But this was the final curtain. History does not remember Nicholas II with hatred. It remembers him with sorrow. A man of soft voice and hard consequences. A ruler too weak for his age. a father who loved deeply, and a czar who ruled poorly. He did not slaughter his people with rage. He let them die through neglect. He was not a tyrant by design, but by inaction, by silence, by belief that the world would stay as it had always been. And so it moved on without him. The Romanov name faded into myth, echoing in old photographs and dusty rooms. The palaces still stand, but the crown is gone. Russia would become something else entirely. Something colder. Something red. In Nicholas. Nicholas would be remembered not as a ruler who fell, but as a man who never truly stood. Emperor Heliogabalus. A name whispered through the marble halls of Rome like a fever dream, half monarch, half myth. Born in the sun-scorched province of Syria, he would rise, almost absurdly, to the throne of the greatest empire on earth. And yet, his reign would be a blur of incense and scandal, of roses and blood. Tonight, dear dreamer, let us drift backward, to a time when the Tiber River carried secrets, and the stars looked down upon madness crowned in gold. Soft candlelight flickers across the face of a sleeping statue, fade into the desert winds of a mesa. He was born Varius Avitus Bassianus, high priest of the eastern sun god Heliogabalus, a deity of fire, stone, and celestial rites. In Emesa, he had been a sacred vessel, draped in silks and incense, worshipped more like a divine relic than a child. But ambition knows no borders. His mother, Julia Soemias, and grandmother, Julia Misa, descendants of the mighty Severan dynasty, held the strings. With the Emperor Caracalla murdered in the usurper Macrinus weak, they saw an opening. They whispered to the legions that the boy was Caracalla's true heir. The soldiers, ever loyal to the Severan blood, rallied behind the painted youth. At just 14, Bassianus marched on Rome under a new name, Heliogabalus, after his god. Not merely a ruler, but a living deity. Rome, weary and bleeding from civil war, bent the knee once more. The screen darkens to a moody golden dusk. The silhouette of a child emperor draped in priestly robes rises over the Palatine Hill. What followed was not governance, but a grotesque theater. The Senate, the people, even his own Praetorian Guard watched with incredulous awe as tradition crumbled beneath velvet sandals. Heliogabalus cared little for politics, less for Rome's customs. He built a lavish temple to his god and demanded all others bow before it. Jupiter himself, the king of Roman gods, was made subordinate. Sacred relics from every cult were seized and absorbed into his new faith. A black meteorite, Heliogabalus' sacred stone, was paraded through the city in a golden chariot, drawn not by horses, but by naked women. But it was not only his god he imposed, it was himself. He wore makeup and silk, dressed as a bride, and often referred to himself in the feminine. He reportedly offered fortunes to any physician who could surgically give him female genitalia. He married 5 times, including to a Vestal virgin, an act of sacrilege so severe it chilled the bones of the old aristocracy. Yet he declared his true spouse to be Hierocles, a blonde slave and charioteer, whom he called his husband. Banquets descended into surreal debauchery. Dishes made of hummingbird tongues and camel heels. Guests suffocated beneath cascades of rose petals dropped from ceilings. Nobles invited to dine found themselves seated with monkeys and wild beasts. Others were served stones instead of food, their reactions a spectacle for the emperor's amusement. Behind his painted smile was chaos, his rule not of iron nor law, but of caprice and spectacle. But Rome, ancient and unyielding, does not forget, nor forgive. His extravagances turned admiration into disgust. The army, once swayed by coin and spectacle, began to murmur. The Senate plotted quietly. Even his own grandmother, who had once pulled strings to raise him, now saw the danger in the doll she had made king. In a desperate bid to retain power, Heliogabalus adopted his cousin, the boy Alexander Severus, hoping to calm the nobility and the guard. But the Praetorians favored Alexander, and soon, the emperor's paranoia deepened. Heliogabalus tried to rescind the adoption. He plotted against his cousin. He threatened the guard. The last strands of loyalty snapped. One cold morning in 222 AD, the Praetorians struck. They found the emperor and his mother cowering in a latrine in the palace. Dragged through the streets, their bodies were mutilated and thrown into the Tiber. The waters that had borne emperors now swallowed the last of Heliogabalus. His reign had lasted just 4 years. 4 years of incense and irreverence, of defiance and decay. Some called him mad. Others merely misunderstood. A boy forced into power, trying to forge a world that reflected his soul, only to find himself crushed by the weight of Rome's cold, eternal stone. Was he a monster or a mirror? A deviant tyrant or a victim of the age? His memory, damned by the Senate, erased from inscriptions, scratched from stone. And yet, the story remained. A flare of divine madness in the twilight of an empire. A flame too bright, too strange to last. King Sigismund III of Poland. He was born beneath a flickering cross of 2 crowns, destined, so it seemed, for greatness. A man with the blood of Jagiellons and vases, of Poles and Swedes, of saints and soldiers. His eyes, solemn and dark, would one day gaze out across 2 kingdoms, and see them fall like sand through trembling fingers. This is not the story of a tyrant who bathed in blood, nor a madman lost in labyrinths of cruelty. This is the tale of a king who simply failed, in ways too vast to count, and too quiet to forget. A man who, by trying to rule everything, lost almost everything. So settle in, dear listener. Let the lights dim low. Let the centuries blur. And drift back with me to the cold courts of Krakow, where the incense clings to crimson robes, and a man dreams not just of ruling 1 throne, but 2. Sigismund was crowned King of Poland in 1587, chosen in the swirl of a royal election. Poland being, at the time, a curious creature, a monarchy that elected its monarchs. A kingdom where nobles held the real reins. He was young, handsome, devout, raised in Sweden but fated to reign in the sprawling lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, where winter winds swept across the steppes and parliament spoke in fractious tongues. And yet, mere years later, he would be crowned again, King of Sweden, by blood right, inheriting his father's northern crown. 2 thrones, 2 crowns, 1 king. It was a dream of empire. A vision of uniting the North beneath Catholic rule, a bulwark against rising Protestantism. But dreams, when built on pride and fantasy, so often turn bitter. Sigismund returned to Sweden a stranger, greeted not by loyal subjects, but by suspicion. His deep Catholic faith, so rigid and unyielding, clashed with Sweden's Protestant soul. He refused compromise. He brought Jesuits. He offended old allies. And in his absence, his uncle, Duke Charles, stirred discontent into open rebellion. The great union of crowns that Sigismund imagined would last centuries. It unraveled in a single campaign. In 1599, he was deposed by his own people. His northern kingdom lost forever. The Swedish crown, like a ghost, haunted him for the rest of his life. The failure in Sweden might have been enough to humble another king. But Sigismund clung to his divine right like a man drowning clutches a stone. Back in Poland, he turned his gaze inward. Yet even here, his rule sowed more ruin. Obsessed with reclaiming Sweden, he drained the treasury, fueled endless wars, and deepened religious divisions. He ruled not through wisdom or adaptation, but by obstinacy. He ignored the noble parliament, attempted to install absolute monarchy, and filled his court with foreigners and sycophants. A king in name, a puppet in practice. And still, the wars dragged on. One by one, his missteps opened the gates to catastrophe. In 1605, at the Battle of Kirchholm, his forces defeated the Swedes with stunning power, but the victory brought no peace, only more war. He embroiled Poland in Muscovy's chaos, hoping to plant his son on the Russian throne during the time of troubles. And for a moment, it seemed possible. The Kremlin even opened its gates. But greed, arrogance, and fanaticism ruined it all. His soldiers looted churches. His generals insulted allies. The Russian people rose in fury, and once again, a crown slipped from Sigismund's grasp. Wherever he reached, north, east, west, he left smoldering failure in his wake. By the time his beard turned gray, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had grown weary of their king. What once was the jewel of Europe, vibrant, multicultural, rich in grain and gold, had become frayed at the edges, bled by wars, divided by faith, led by a monarch who no longer saw the people, only his own ambitions. Sigismund spent his final years cloistered in Krakow, poring over maps, plotting campaigns that would never come. He still dreamed of Sweden, of Russia, of glory. But outside his palace, the world shifted. The Ottoman threat loomed. The Cossacks rebelled. The nobles, once patient, whispered of reform. Without him, he died in 1632, aged 65, having ruled Poland for over 4 decades. A long reign, but not a great one. He left behind a fractured realm, and a legacy not of triumph, but of wasted chances. His son, the Ladislaw, would inherit the throne, but also the wars, the debts, the discontent. And within 50 years, the Commonwealth would begin its slow, tragic spiral toward partition and oblivion. So was Sigismund III a cruel king? No, but he was blind to the world as it was, clinging instead to visions of what could never be. Inflexible, isolated, obsessed with crowns he could not wear, and indifferent to the one he did. And in that blindness, in that stubborn dream, he doomed the golden age of Poland to its twilight. A king who held everything, twice, and let it all slip away. George IV, a king born into brocade and brilliance, yet remembered not for triumph, but for a life unraveling in slow, gilded decay. Tonight, dear dreamer, we drift back to the gaslit courts of Regency Britain, where opulence masked-wrought, and a sovereign once hailed as charming and cultured grew bloated on vanity, vice, and self-deception. This is the story of a man who ascended to the throne not as a hero of the people, but as a cautionary figure of excess, his reign a theater of indulgence, estrangement, and the quiet corrosion of monarchy. So settle into stillness, breathe deeply, and let us descend into the dreamlike world of a prince who became a parody of kingship. He was born in 1762, the first son of King George III, a monarch famed for his moral rigor and tragic descent into madness. George Augustus Frederick, the Prince of Wales, emerged into a world already brimming with expectation. Groomed for power, surrounded by grandeur, he was every inch a royal from the cradle. And at first he dazzled. With his impeccable taste for fashion, art, and architecture, he seemed a modern Apollo, refined, intelligent, and bursting with charm. He championed the neoclassical style, employed the best tailors in London, and collected paintings with the eye of a seasoned aesthete. But behind the polished surface lay the seeds of ruin. By the time he was 21, the prince had racked up staggering debts from lavish entertainments, extravagant wardrobes, and nights spent in gambling dens and taverns far from the eyes of court. His father, the sober George III, was appalled. The prince was forbidden from marrying without consent, so he rebelled. In secret, George married a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, in defiance of both royal law and religious mandate. The marriage was invalid under British law, but it tethered George emotionally for decades. It also revealed a pattern that would define his life: desire without consequence, indulgence without restraint. By the 1790s, the once dashing prince had grown corpulent, sallow, and sluggish. His debts ballooned past what Parliament could easily excuse. He was ridiculed in satirical prints, his bloated frame, his gluttony, his mock dignity, rendered in cruel ink across the streets of London. And yet, he longed to rule. Fate would grant him that wish, though not quite as he imagined. In 1811, with his father slipping irrevocably into madness, Parliament declared George Prince Regent, a monarch in all but name. And for 9 long years, he ruled Britain in this twilight state, not quite king, not quite prince, but somewhere in between. The Regency era glimmered. It was an age of artistic bloom, glittering salons, and architectural marvels like the Brighton Pavilion, an exotic fantasy palace dreamed up by George himself, all onion domes and silken splendor. But beneath the surface, the country staggered under the weight of war, poverty, and unrest. The Napoleonic Wars bled the treasury dry. The poor rioted. The Luddites smashed machines in protest of industrial change. And while the nation strained and starved, the regent dined. He feasted daily on banquets of 50 dishes, wore jeweled uniforms he barely fit into, and surrounded himself with sycophants who flattered his every folly. His estranged wife, Caroline of Brunswick, was banned from court. His daughter Charlotte, the sole heir who might have redeemed the dynasty, died in childbirth in 1817, her passing mourned by the nation, but met with cold indifference by her father. And when, at last, George III died in 1820, the Prince Regent ascended the throne as King George IV. But it was a hollow coronation. The people jeered, the clergy grimaced, and George, in his golden robes, was too drunk and gout-ridden to walk unaided. A king in name, a shadow of power. His reign, though brief, was steeped in disappointment. He ruled for just 10 years, from 1820 to 1830, presiding over a government increasingly run by ministers while he withdrew into bitter solitude. His physical decline mirrored his fading relevance, swollen with dropsy, ravaged by gluttony, and lost in the illusions of grandeur. He rarely appeared in public. In one of his final acts of political cruelty, he attempted to bar his estranged wife Caroline from his coronation, triggering a scandal so immense it threatened to unseat the very monarchy. She died shortly after, denied even the dignity of her royal station. George IV, once the darling of the aristocracy, had become a laughingstock, a bloated emblem of a monarchy out of touch with its people. Even those who served him spoke in whispers of his vanity, his deceit, his insatiable appetite for praise and pleasure. When he died in 1830, few wept. The Times remarked coldly that there never was an individual less regretted by his fellow creatures than this deceased king. A final verdict written not in rebellion, but in weariness. And so fades the memory of George IV, a king crowned in silk, but mired in scandal, a sovereign with the soul of a hedonist, whose grandeur crumbled into grotesquerie. He left behind palaces, paintings, and debts, but no legacy of virtue, no echo of wisdom. This was a life of art without purpose, power without empathy, and privilege squandered in pursuit of hollow pleasures. Yet even in his failure, there is something tragic. A man so desperate to be adored, and so utterly unable to be loved. Sultan Ibrahim I, in the cavernous shadows of Topkapi Palace, where incense drifted like forgotten prayers and silk whispered against stone, there once lived a man who should never have worn a crown. He was not a conqueror, nor a thinker, nor even a ruler by nature. He was a ghost of war and blood, born to empire but nurtured by terror. They called him Ibrahim the Mad. And yet, before the madness, there was a boy born in 1615, to Sultan Ahmed I and Kozum Sultan, in a realm at the height of its imperial splendor, an Ottoman empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. He was the youngest of his brothers, and in the palace of golden domes and deadly silences, youth offered no protection. In that world, brothers were not siblings. They were threats, and threats had to be eliminated. Tonight, dear dreamer, let us drift to a time of empire and fragility, where the scent of roses mingled with the iron of betrayal, and where the weight of a crown broke the mind of a man. This is the sorrowful story of Sultan Ibrahim I, the caged prince, the mad Padishah, one of the worst kings in history. For 23 years, Ibrahim lived in the caves, the cage, a shadowy suite within the palace, designed to confine Ottoman princes who posed a threat to the throne. It was meant to prevent fratricide, that cruel tradition of royal brothers killing one another. But in practice, it became a prison of silence and fear. There, in semi-darkness, Ibrahim waited. He watched his brothers disappear, executed one by one, the muffled sobs of their mothers carried through marble walls. He learned to speak in whispers, to flinch at every footstep, to fear the very blood that ran in his veins. And then, in 1640, everything changed. His brother Murad IV, tyrannical, iron-willed, and childless, was dead, and Ibrahim, the last male heir, was called forth. But he did not believe it. He refused to leave his cage, suspecting it was a trick. He believed Murad still lived, that the court sought only to lure him out and kill him. It took the Grand Vizier dragging him before his brother's cold corpse to convince him. And so, trembling, broken, confused, the caged prince became sultan. But power does not heal all wounds. From the moment Ibrahim ascended the throne, madness began to bloom like mold on silk. He distrusted his advisors, and trusted them too much. He fell under the sway of charlatans, astrologers, and sycophants who whispered poison into his ear. He drowned his doubts in excess. Indulgence became his daily bread. The harem swelled to over 300 concubines. One woman, known only as Secretary, the sugar cube, rose from servant to seductress to sultana in mere weeks, wielding enormous power with a sweet smile and honeyed lies. He obsessed over odors, ordering gallons of perfume poured into fountains, and demanded his pillows be soaked in musk and rose water. His madness deepened. In a fit of jealous suspicion, he had hundreds of his concubines tied in sacks and thrown into the Bosporus, believing one had looked at another man. He ordered fur-lined walls for his rooms to protect against the cold voices. He fixated on a particular breed of fat-tailed sheep, considering it holy, and built lavish palaces for them. And all the while, the empire burned. Venetians attacked the islands. The treasury dwindled. Corruption bloomed. And the Janissaries, the once mighty military elite, crumbled like distant thunder. By 1648, the empire could bear him no longer. The people rioted. The soldiers mutinied. And even his own mother, the once powerful Kozum Sultan, turned against him. The ulama, the scholars of Islam, declared him unfit to rule. He was deposed, dragged from his perfumed chambers, screaming, pleading, wrapped in silk and madness. He was imprisoned once more, not in the cage of his youth, but in a deeper, darker place. A few months later, a deaf-mute executioner crept into his cell. With a silken bowstring, he did what the empire had long begged for. Ibrahim I was 33, and so the boy who lived too long in the shadows became a king who brought shadow to his realm. Was he a victim of cruelty, or its inevitable consequence? Was his madness born of confinement, or was the empire itself already mad, and he merely its mirror? History offers no mercy, only memory, and in the halls of Ottoman power, where ghosts still pace over faded carpets, his name lingers like smoke. Ibrahim the Mad, Sultan of Sorrow, one of the worst kings in history. King Charles XII of Sweden. He was born beneath winter stars and baptized in the cold fire of a northern empire, an empire already trembling beneath the weight of its ambition. Crowned at the age of 15, Charles entered a world of frostbitten wars and fraying power, where the line between greatness and madness grew thinner by the year. Tonight, dear dreamer, we drift into a tale of relentless storms and frozen battlefields, a tale of a boy king who became a warrior, a ghost, a warning. Let the flicker of candlelight slow your breath. Let history unfold gently as we begin the long, wintry fall of Sweden's Lion of the North. In the year 1697, as plague swept the continent and the ashes of past kings cooled in their tombs, Charles ascended the throne. He was not meant to be ordinary. Raised in silence, disciplined with Spartan rigor, denied soft comforts, he was molded into something sharp, cold, and unyielding. Tall, austere, and strangely detached, Charles avoided wine, women, and music, preferring long hours on horseback and solitary study of warcraft. He slept little, spoke less, and believed himself chosen by God not for peace, but for struggle. And struggle came swiftly. Within 3 short years, a great alliance formed against him. The Tsar of Russia, the King of Poland, and the King of Denmark. The Great Northern War had begun, and Charles, only 18, charged into history with a sword in one hand and divine conviction in the other. At first, it seemed he would not fail. He shattered Danish forces with a sudden invasion. Then he marched on Russia, defeating Peter the Great at the Battle of Narva in a blinding snowstorm. A victory so improbable, it seemed to touch myth. But like all tragic kings, Charles mistook glory for permanence. For years he chased war across the eastern wastes. He refused to return home. He refused to rest. He plunged deeper into Russia, drawn ever forward by a vision only he could see: Sweden as an eternal empire, himself as an unbreakable sword. And so he marched, through mud, sleet, and hunger. In 1708, he pushed south, aiming for Moscow. But Peter the Great was no longer the desperate Tsar of Narva. He had learned, adapted, waited. Then came Poltava. On a sweltering June morning in 1709, the Swedish army, battered and starved, faced a Russian force nearly twice its size. Charles, wounded days before, could not ride. He commanded from a litter, his body failing even as his pride remained intact. The battle was a catastrophe. Swedish lines crumbled. Thousands died. Thousands more were taken prisoner. Sweden's power collapsed in a single, brutal stroke. But Charles did not return home. Instead, he fled, across rivers, deserts, and foreign lands, to the Ottoman Empire, where he would linger for 5 long years, like a shadow that forgot how to fade. In Turkey, Charles became a stranger even to his allies. He refused to leave. He meddled in Ottoman politics, demanded armies they would not give, and resisted every attempt to send him home. He wrote endless letters to his ministers in Stockholm, ordering taxes, raising troops, pretending still that the war had not been lost. Back in Sweden, famine grew. Trade died. The treasury emptied. His people, once proud, now starved and whispered. But Charles would not hear their cries. He believed in only one thing: war. In 1714, after his hosts had had enough, Charles finally rode back to Sweden. He did not rest. He did not mourn. He began planning another invasion, this time against Norway. And there, in a frozen trench outside the fortress of Fredrikstad, on a moonless night in 1718, a bullet struck his head. He died instantly. Some say it was a sniper. Others whisper of betrayal of his own men, tired of the endless cold, the endless silence, the endless war. He was 36 years old, and so the Lion of the North became a statue in the snow. He had reigned for 2 decades, but spent half his life in exile, chasing enemies who no longer feared him, commanding armies that no longer existed, dreaming of victories no longer possible. His wars cost Sweden its empire, its gold, its sons. When he died, he left no heir. Only a ruined nation, a broken people, and the haunting memory of a boy who mistook silence for strength and war for wisdom. Was he brave or blind? A genius or a ghost? In the end, Charles XII remains one of history's loneliest monarchs, a king who marched ever forward, until there was nothing left to conquer but his own ruin. King Charles X of France, a name whispered through the corridors of fallen palaces. The last Bourbon monarch to sit upon the French throne, and the one who, in his blind devotion to the past, sleepwalked a nation into revolution. So settle in, dear dreamer. Let the flicker of candlelight soften the world around you. Let the tapestries of time unfurl. As we drift into the age of velvet gloves and iron will, of trembling courts and crumbling crowns, this is the story of a king who would not wake from the dream of yesterday. And so yesterday came to claim him. France, once the brightest jewel of Europe, had long since cracked. The revolution had shattered the on-skin regime, spilled the blood of kings, and crowned new ideas in their place: liberty, equality, fraternity. Yet, as the decades passed, the scars remained tender. The Bourbons returned to a cautious throne after Napoleon's fall, tiptoeing across the ash of guillotines. Among them stood Charles Philippe, the younger brother of the executed Louis XVI. Soft-spoken, devout, and exiled for much of his life, Charles X emerged from the shadows with powder dignity. A man molded not by the present, but by the ghosts of Versailles. He became king in 1824, already in his 60s. His silvered hair gleaming like a relic of a vanished age. To many, he was the wrong man for the wrong century. To Charles, the century itself was the mistake. He believed France could return to its former holiness, its divine hierarchy of crown and altar, as if the tides of revolution could be commanded to retreat. And so he began, from the moment of his coronation at Reims. A glittering ceremony soaked in medieval pageantry. How Charles declared his reign a holy restoration. He kissed sacred relics. He anointed himself as a monarch by God's will. The people watched, uneasy. He restored land to exiled nobles, offered compensation to families who had lost fortunes in the revolution. He censored the press, strengthened the church, and favored the old elite at every turn. But France had changed. The cities had swelled with workers, thinkers, merchants, men who read newspapers and remembered the Bastille. And still, Charles X turned his back. In 1830, he crossed a line, facing criticism in the press and a hostile chamber of deputies. He issued the July Ordinances, a royal decree that dissolved the legislature, suspended the constitution, and silenced the press entirely. He believed he was defending monarchy. In truth, he was suffocating it. The reaction was swift, electric, unstoppable. In Paris, barricades rose like weeds. The tricolor flag returned to windows. The people shouted not in fear, but in fury. The July Revolution had begun. The fighting lasted only 3 days. 3 days to unmake a king. Charles, in disbelief, peered from his palace windows. As smoke curled over the rooftops of Paris, his guards fled. The army hesitated. In the very city he ruled had no more room for kings of his kind. He abdicated, not for himself, but in favor of his grandson, clinging to a dynastic thread already severed. It was too late. France turned to a different monarch, Louis Philippe. A king of the people, or so he claimed. Charles X, now unmoored, fled into exile once more. Not as a prince in waiting this time, but as the last of his kind. A relic wrapped in fading velvet, carried out of France like a portrait too heavy for the new walls. He would die in Austria 6 years later, his health broken, his dreams intact. Still certain he had been right. Charles X was not cruel. He was not tyrannical in the way of despots or madmen. But his tragedy was in his devotion to a France that no longer existed. He ruled as though history had paused for his return, as though the revolution had been a storm that passed without consequence. And in doing so, he provoked the very forces he wished to erase. History does not bend backward for dreamers. Even kings must wake, or be swept away. James II of England. A name whispered in the darker corners of Britain's royal memory. A king remembered less for what he built, and more for what he broke. Faith, trust, and a centuries-old balance between crown and country. Let your thoughts slow now. Settle into stillness, and listen as the story of this troubled monarch unfolds, not with the roar of war drums, but with the quiet sorrow of a reign that unraveled beneath the weight of fear and stubborn pride. There are kings who shaped empires, kings who stirred revolutions, and kings who stumbled so deeply into folly, their fall became a cautionary tale etched into the soul of a nation. James Stuart was born in 1633, the second surviving son of Charles I, at a time when England teetered on the edge of civil war. He was not raised in peace, nor crowned in glory. His youth was soaked in violence, exile, and loss. He watched his father beheaded by Parliament, his monarchy dismantled, his world torn asunder. And so he fled from Whitehall to France, from prince to pauper. And there, in the glittering courts of Catholic Europe, a seed was planted, not of faith alone, but of defiance and destiny. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, it was James's older brother, Charles II, who took the throne, a merry monarch, charming and cynical, willing to bend when the winds demanded. James, by contrast, was iron. He returned not just as the Duke of York, but as a man forged in exile, devout, grim, unyielding. A secret Catholic in a Protestant kingdom. A soldier by instinct, a king by misfortune. He commanded fleets. He crushed rebellions. He became heir to a crown that did not quite trust him. And still, the kingdom waited. Waited as rumors grew. Waited as James married a Catholic princess from Italy. Waited as he openly embraced the old religion, unrepentant, unafraid, unwise. In 1685, the waiting ended. Charles died. James was king. For what do you give a man who spent his life preparing for power, but never learning to wield it? His reign began with blood. The Monmouth Rebellion, an uprising led by his illegitimate nephew, was crushed quickly and cruelly. James unleashed Judge Jeffreys and the bloody assizes, hundreds hanged, thousands exiled, women burned, boys beaten. Justice drowned in vengeance. And yet James believed he ruled by divine right, not by consent, not by law, but by God alone. He repealed laws protecting Protestants. He packed Parliament with loyalists. He filled the army with Catholics. He dissolved voices of dissent. England, a nation that had once executed his father for tyranny, now watched in growing dread. Whispers in taverns. Sermons in secret. Could the past be repeating? But James would not see. He would not bend. And when his queen gave birth to a Catholic heir, an infant prince who would keep the old faith alive, the final thread snapped. The fear became a flame. They called it the Glorious Revolution. In truth, it was barely a battle. No pitched armies, no smoking ruins. Just a foreign prince, invited by Parliament, sailing from Holland to save England from its king. William of Orange was Protestant, pragmatic, prepared, and James fled. In December 1688, he slipped away under cover of night. First caught, then freed again, until finally, cold, humiliated, abandoned, he escaped to France, where Louis XIV received him with solemn pity. He would never return. He would die in exile, like his youth began, writing letters, praying, waiting for a restoration that never came. His final years spent wandering the faded halls of Saint-Germain, a ghost of a king, weeping for a crown he could no longer wear. James II believed he was chosen, ordained, but in the end, it was his refusal to listen, to compromise, to understand the soul of his own people that led to his fall. He was not a tyrant by nature, but by fear, not evil, but blind. A man trapped by his past and by his faith in a world that had already moved beyond him. And so England changed. The age of absolute monarchy died with James's flight. The Bill of Rights was born, and with it, a new chapter. But still, the wind carries his name. A king who reigned for 3 brief years, and whose downfall changed a nation forever.